professor here at the Citadel. I teach both economics and entrepreneurship. And this is part of our BB&T Moral Foundations of Capitalism lecture series. And we're happy tonight to be partnering with the College of Charleston on this event. And real quick, while I've set up our speakers, microphone, and everything, Dr. Calcino, why don't I welcome you to the podium for you to talk a little bit about Adam Smith Week and then introduce the person who will introduce our speaker.
I want to thank you all for coming out tonight and for Dr. Sobel for partnering with us. As I said, I'm Dr. Peter Calcano. I'm a professor of economics at the College of Charleston and the director of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process. And we're in the midst of our Adam Smith Week. This is our 17th annual Adam Smith Week. The center does a variety of programming. I would encourage you to look for us on the College of Charleston's webpage to learn more about it. But right now, I want to turn over the introduction to one of our market process scholars, Abby Elmore, to do the introduction.
I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for this evening, Dr. Ann Bradley. She's the George and Sally Mayer Fellow for Economic Education and Vice President of Academic Affairs at the Fund for American Studies. Dr. Bradley received her bachelor's in economics from James Madison University. She then went on to get her master's and PhD in economics from George Mason University. Before joining the Fund for American Studies, Dr. Bradley served as the Vice President of Economic Initiative at the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. Alongside her work at the Fund for American Studies, Dr. Bradley is a professor of economics at the Institute for World Politics. She has several publications and is the co-editor and co-author of Counting the Cost, Christian Perspective of Capitalism, For the Least of These, A Biblical Answer to Poverty, and Be Fruitful and Mindful, Why Economics is Necessary for Making God-Pleasing Decisions. We are honored to have Dr. Bradley with us today, and I for one am excited to hear her speak, and with that I'd like to hand this off.
Thank you, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me okay in the back? Okay. Nothing like the speaker being late to their own talk. That's a new one for me. So, and I understand that I'm standing in between you and dinner, and so I'm aware of that constraint as well. So I've got my kind of timer up here to keep myself honest. In the short time that we have tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about this research, and then I'm going to leave time for some questions. But the background is that I'm an economist, trained as an economist, and graduated from George Mason University in 2006. But at the beginning of my graduate studies, 9/11 happened. And so at the time, I was working with a faculty member who was a kind of a public choice scholar, and he said to me, right after 9/11, it was a couple weeks after 9/11, said, you know, the world is going to change a lot right now, and it's going to change because we don't know what's happening in terms of, you know, when is the next terrorist attack? What is it going to look like? Will there be another one? Al-Qaeda was not a name on the lips of Americans really prior to that day. He also was worried about the policy response. And the reason he was worried about the policy response is because policy has to kind of reconcile itself with the laws of economics. And if it doesn't do that, then we actually won't get the outcomes that we desire. Additionally, we might create a host of unintended consequences. So he invited me to write a paper with him, and when you're a grad student, you get basically like a guaranteed published paper. I said, sure, I'll write about terrorism. I know nothing about it, but let's do this. And I ended up writing my entire dissertation on the political economy of terrorism using Al-Qaeda as a case study. So that's what I'm going to briefly talk about tonight. I then, you know, I went to graduate school to be a professor, but my same professor said, you need to go work for the CIA now. And I said, well, why would I do that? And he said, well, you kind of developed this theory, this economic theory of this behavior. And the people at the CIA actually are trying to kind of track these guys down and understand better what they're doing so they can reduce what, you know, this behavior. And I said, okay, why not? So I did go work for the agency for a while. I worked in terror finance. I worked on the analytical side, so we worked with the spies. They collected information in the field, and then we kind of tried to translate that for policymakers. And one of the things we did was, in terror finance, we tried to figure out what they were doing with their money. So terrorists are smart. They're notorious for just creating kind of a fake humanitarian organization like an NGO overnight. In some of the poorest parts of the world, this NGO might have, you know, kind of $30 million, and you say, well, gee, that's weird. Where did you get that money? And so we would try to be able to kind of understand the tracking of that money, and then we would work with the Treasury Department to declare them a terrorist organization. So that's kind of my practical experience, and now I spend a lot of my time in the classroom, which I love very much. So I want to kind of give an economic approach to this topic. I think, again, right at 9/11, you know, I was not called into any important rooms, but I'm fairly certain that lots of military leaders were called, the National Security Council was called, like all these people were called into the room to figure out what we're going to do, but nobody called an economist. And I actually think that's a mistake, because economists study human decisions. That's what we do. And so I like this kind of analogy of thinking about Cadillacy, or the Cadillactics of the market, right? Which is this theory of how human beings make decisions under conditions of scarcity and uncertainty. And so that was my starting point as a young, you know, kind of graduate student trying to figure out, why are terrorists doing the things that they do? And so to start with that, we have to apply to them the same assumptions about human nature that we do when we're looking at all sorts of other choices, right? So when you're thinking about, like, why do people eat donuts instead of avocado toast, right? Like, maybe donuts taste better even though avocado toast is better for you. So we can study those types of decisions and what motivates them and incentives that are matter for those decisions. And we can do that with terrorism too. And I thought one of the mistakes, as I look back, right, we have 25 years now in the war on terror, 24 years. And in that time, I'm not sure we've successfully done some of these things that I think we need to do to help us get a sense of what policies are going to work better than others. And so one of the things that I like to start out with, again, kind of just thinking about the basics of economics, is that terrorists are trying to maximize their benefits that they experience. That's, I don't think, a very controversial statement. They're also trying to minimize the cost. So they're not crazy. And if you listen to the language that people use, especially right after 9/11, that was the language. It is that terrorists are somehow categorically different than we are. They operate differently than we do. They make choices differently than we do. And so, you know, kind of, what do we do about that? How do we figure out what they do? And I think that's the wrong premise. The premise should be that they are like us in that they are human beings. They maximize benefits, and they work incredibly hard to minimize costs. They're savvy, and they're smart, and that's the problem. Al-Qaeda was incredibly successful on a very small budget on 9/11. That's the terrifying part, right? It's not that it was a billion-dollar industry with lots of people with PhDs running around, all these types of things. They built an organization. They had a tiny organization. They were very successful at what they did, and they were able to execute a very successful, in their eyes, terrorist attack, although even 9/11 fell short of what they wanted it to be, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The other thing here is that self-interest is at work, just like it is with all other human behavior. So kind of the way I like people to think about this is to ask the question, do you think terrorists love their moms? And I'm not even being trite. I mean, the answer is, sure they do, just like everybody else, right? So the terrorist is operating with human emotion, right? They want to do things that they think are going to benefit them. And when they decide to join or start a terrorist organization, those are two very different sets of activities. So that was another thing I thought was really important, was to take these assumptions and apply it to the different levels of the Al-Qaeda organization. What bin Laden wanted is different than what a recruit wants. So what they seek, what they're looking for inside that organization matters very much to whether they're able to grow the organization. So they are appealing to the terrorists as human beings, right? And in fact, they love their moms so much that to join Al-Qaeda, you are given a community. You are given a family, if you will. Brothers in arms, okay? And you are, in fact, with Al-Qaeda, if you are going to be a suicide bomber or lose your life for the cause of terrorism, your family is going to get paid a stipend. Right? So there's no free lunch anywhere in life, and that's true here too. So I think the problem, right, is that if we start running around saying things like terrorists are crazy, this is not the way economists think. right? Some people surely in the world are crazy, right? But it's a very small percentage of the population. And what we mean by rational actors in terms of the economic way of thinking is we mean that terrorists weigh costs and benefits, right? So it has to be worth it for them to join. For bin Laden to actually himself leave this life of luxury that he was born into, he had to view that the building of Al-Qaeda was going to get him his goals accomplished. He didn't do it because he was bored and a billionaire and had nothing better to do. Right? Terrorists don't do these things for those reasons. So again, very important that we start with the right assumptions, because if we don't, then what we're assuming is that these specific group of people do not respond to incentives. And if they don't respond to incentives, there's literally nothing you can do to stop terrorism. You can shoot them and you can put them in jail. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do that anyway, right? But that's a kind of reactive response to terrorism as a social problem. So we have to shoot them and we have to lock them up, but you'll have to do that forever. What you really want is a world where the demand for terrorism decreases over time. And so my very simple economic model here is, if you've taken an econ class, you've seen this before, that there's a supply curve for terrorism and a demand curve for terrorism. And the supply curve is upward sloping and the demand curve is downward sloping. Now, this is not as easy to kind of understand as, if we have, you go to Starbucks and you buy coffee or a latte, we can measure that. We can understand those transactions. We can say this many people in Charleston, South Carolina bought vanilla lattes today. We can understand kind of that market pretty easily and pretty well. Terrorists are not selling their goods in the open market like Starbucks is, right? But there's still a demand curve. Who are the demanders? So they could be a variety of people. Some of them are what I call the couch surfers. Okay, so these are the people that are like rooting for their sports team, but they're rooting for their terrorist organization to accomplish its goals. So there's a culture or an environment where the people in society say, this is a great idea. Al-Qaeda's forming, they're going to restore the caliphate, they're going to establish this fundamentalist Islamic kind of, it's really pan-national what Al-Qaeda's doing. It's beyond borders. That was their goal. And how do we know this? Because bin Laden loved to talk about his beliefs, which is very helpful for researchers. Because you just go read what he said. Some of what he says is hyperbolic because he's fundraising. Okay, so some of what he says is probably beyond the scope of what he actually believed he could do, right? And you hear this is very common, right? Lots of people, legitimate politicians use hyperbole, right? Because they want buy-in. So the demand curve is made of those type of people. Those are very hard for us to get our hands on. Who are they? Well, we don't really know, right? Because they're kind of silent cheerleaders, and they're just happy that Al-Qaeda exists because they're going to do something vague, like destroy the West, or end capitalism, right? Like whether bin Laden actually believes he's going to end capitalism is a different matter, but these are the talking points, right? There's also other terrorist organizations. They could be part of the demand curve, right? They say, we like what you're doing, we have aligned goals, so let's help each other. There could be state sponsors of terrorism that provide assets, resources, land, all sorts of safe haven, all these types of things, right? So there's a variety of different components of that demand curve. And I think that's in the intelligence field today what we need to get a really good handle on. The supply of terrorism is a little bit easier to understand. It's the groups themselves. Al-Qaeda itself is a supplier of terrorism, right? Organized similarly to a firm or a nonprofit organization. It has a mission, it has goals, it knows what it wants to do, and it kind of declares those things. So I'm going to kind of skim through some of this and get to some of the better parts. But in doing this research, both when I started in 2000, I would say I started working on this maybe in 2002, 2003, and two colleagues of mine, we published a monograph on this about a year and a half ago, so kind of continuing to do the research. It is amazing that we do not have an agreed upon definition of terrorism. So this is a problem even within the USG. Right? So the Patriot Act has a definition, the DoD has a definition, the Department of State has a definition, the U.S. Army Manual has a definition. Now that there is some overlap, right? But a couple things are true. One is that there's just not one cause of terrorism. And after 9/11, this is what a lot of the academic literature was trying to determine. Can we profile terrorists? In the same way if you watch any of those shows like Criminal Minds, right? What are they trying to do? They're trying to profile serial killers. We can figure out what they do, kind of generally what motivates them, then we can target them and catch them easier. So those attempts were and are made to try to figure out who are the terrorists. And so a lot of obvious talking points might come to mind, like maybe they're poor, maybe they're from poor countries, maybe they're of a certain religion, maybe they're from specific countries that are all those things, right? And what the research showed us is very hard to profile a terrorist. Some terrorists are poor, those tend to be the recruits, the lower ranking members of the organization. But if you look at the leadership of bin Laden, of Al-Qaeda, these are very accomplished people, very smart, they have multiple advanced degrees, and they are wealthy people. So some people, right, foot soldiers might join because they want the camaraderie, they want shelter, they want food, they generally agree with the goals. This is not why bin Laden starts the organization, right? So we kind of have to understand the incentives at a variety of different levels. But one thing we kind of zoned in on is that terrorists always choose non-combatant targets. So this is not a military fight, right? This is you are choosing innocent people that have done nothing to you, and that is a very intentional choice of your targets. So 9/11, the targets were very symbolic of what the West represents to somebody like bin Laden. So it was not at all an accident that the White House was a target. It's not an accident that the World Trade Center, right? This is kind of is an iconic two buildings that represent kind of banking sector and capitalism in general, all the things they say they hate. And terrorism has a purpose, right? So that's another really important part of the definition, which is they're doing this for a reason. If you want to know the reasons, you have to look at what they talk about, what their goals are. And of course, you know, every terrorist group is a little bit different, even though a lot of them cooperate. So I want to give you a little bit of a sense of Al-Qaeda. This goes way back to the 70s. So of course, in the 70s, the United States becomes more actively involved in the Soviet expansion, right? So we call it the expansion of the Iron Curtain, and this happens in Afghanistan. The Soviets invade in 1979, and they don't leave until 1989. This prompts U.S. intelligence to launch one of the most expensive to date covert operation programs, which is called Operation Cyclone. The United States government, through the CIA, works with Pakistani intelligence organization, which is called the ISI, and they fund the Mujahideen, and they start small, $28 to $30 million a year. By the way, this is in 1970 dollars, so that's a lot. And they grow cumulatively, so over time, this is a $20 billion investment. Still one of the biggest covert operations to date, at least that we know about. There's probably a lot I don't know about because I don't have clearance anymore, so I don't work for the CIA anymore, right? So the enemy of my enemy is maybe my friend here, right? So we're arming the Mujahideen, we're providing weapons, helicopters, all sorts of ammunition, and funding. Bin Laden is on the ground at this time. Now I'm not saying, because I don't know, because it's classified, so very few people know this, whether bin Laden was a direct beneficiary of Operation Cyclone. I don't know, but it doesn't really matter. He was in that environment. He's on the ground, he's an anti-communist, he's an anti-Marxist, and he wants the Soviets out of Afghanistan. So he comes up with, you know, some of his buddies. By the way, he's a billionaire's son, so that's actually really important. This is a picture of Ronald Reagan meeting to discuss parts of Operation Cyclone. So these are pictures. You can just easily find them on the internet, right? So this is members of the Pakistani intelligence agency. So they're working together on the ground in Afghanistan. By the way, two other kind of really important events are happening at the same time, or have been happening. One is the Carter Doctrine, which Jimmy Carter announces in his 1980 State of the Union address, which is that for the first time we're going to position American troops in the Persian Gulf to defend American interests. Bin Laden takes this as a personal fight that the United States government has started with him, and he kind of designates himself as the legitimate representative of Saudi Arabia. So that's all in his mind. The Saudi government ultimately doesn't want to have anything to do with him, and so that forces him into this kind of different position. This is another picture from Operation Cyclone. So this is just so kind of, it's like an ancient lifestyle meets modernity, right? So you have Operation Cyclone ammunition being moved on donkeys through the mountains of Afghanistan. So this is exactly how this worked. Al-Qaeda forms in 1988. So the Carter Doctrine has been going for some time. U.S. troops have been in the Persian Gulf. One other thing I mentioned I would say is that in the post-World War II era, we start to see people get very wealthy across the world, right? So you see economic freedom start to go up over time, etc. GDP goes per capita, starts to grow. As people get wealthier, guess what they want? Energy. Right? So think about all the devices you have in your home, all the outlets you have in your dorm room. People love stuff that takes energy to run. Computers, laptops, all cars, all these types of things, right? So oil as a commodity becomes more politicized in the post-World War II era. And the problem with this is that that political nature of that commodity factors into these fights. So this is just a kind of me explaining the architecture of what's going on because I need to get in the mind of bin Laden and his cronies. I'm not agreeing or disagreeing, I'm disagreeing, right? I'm not agreeing with his arguments, but we have to understand what he believes because it motivates what he does. That's the demand curve, right? So there's a demand curve for this, he's forming the supply curve, and that is going to get us an equilibrium of Al-Qaeda style terrorism. If we want to reduce terrorism, it's not enough to just run around and shoot people. It's necessary but not sufficient. What we have to do is figure out how to reduce the demand curve, which is a very challenging thing to do, but we need to think about it. So it was important for me to try to understand who these people are. So these are the kind of three leaders. Underneath you have the dates of their death. Azzam dies very early in 1989. He's kind of the spiritual leader. And Al-Qaeda adheres, or bin Laden himself adheres to Wahhabism, so a very radical fundamentalist version of Islam, using the imposition of Sharia law. This is his goal. This is what he wants, right? He loved to talk to reporters, so the pictures at the bottom of the screen. In the center, he is being interviewed by a Pakistani journalist. The rifle on the wall, I don't know guns, so maybe that's not a rifle you guys know. But you get the point, right? The gun on the wall, this is a gun that they took, absconded from the Soviets. So he's very proudly displaying, look at the gun, look at what we got, and I'm going to do this open interview, and he did this stuff all the time. So he starts marketing and branding immediately. He doesn't waste any time, which is important for him because he can't. So another kind of idea here that kind of factors into my research, that I'm writing another paper on this right now, looking at the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, but I'll talk about that a different day. There's something in the political science literature that comes about via Mansur Olson, who's an author who writes about this, and he talks about classifying roving bandits versus stationary bandits. And this is kind of the search for different types of governance, okay? So the roving bandit is exactly what it sounds like. It's like a group of thugs, they run around, they go to different places, they extract, they steal resources, right? They plunder and move along. But inside the group, they provide kind of public goods. Excludable private goods, right? All the stuff we talked about, a bed to sleep in, brotherhood, meals, an identity, a vision towards the future, all that stuff, that's provided inside the group, right? So the roving bandit moves around, extracts resources, but never really plans to keep roots. The stationary bandit is in search of more local power and stable power. So they want to stay there, right? Which means they have to have a different relationship with the community. They have to kind of treat the people that they're pillaging from as citizens, if you will. So they're going to provide some public goods, right? So there's cost and benefits between being a roving bandit or a stationary bandit. So I thought, well, maybe this kind of framework of thinking about the emergence of government will help me think about what Al-Qaeda is doing. So my hypothesis on this is that Al-Qaeda, via bin Laden, because of course he's the first leader, he wants to be a stationary bandit. He's from Saudi Arabia, he's the son of a billionaire, he has his entire network is there, and all of his resources are there. People who will help him are there. But he's forced into roving bandit status because after kind of US pressure mounts on Saudi Arabia, he's kicked out of Saudi Arabia in 1992, and he goes to Sudan. He pillages and plunders there, and kind of, again, they're doing training exercises. They're equipping themselves, ultimately for 9/11. And then they get kicked out of Sudan because of more pressure, and they end up in Afghanistan. And of course, the Taliban is formed around the same time. So the Taliban is formed in 1994. Al-Qaeda arrives on the scene in Afghanistan in 1996. And so now you have these A roving bandit meets a stationary bandit, which could be the cause of a lot of conflict. The terrorist groups have real incentives to try to find ways to work together because there's strength in numbers, isn't there? So if these two organizations can cooperate, then they can actually perhaps get more done in terms of extracting more resources and accomplishing more of their missions. Now, I think the reason that that works is because they have different goals. So Al-Qaeda is, again, more of a pan-national movement. It wants to see the destruction of the West, so they speak in these kind of bigger, broader, more vague terms in some ways. Taliban wants regional dominance, right, after the toppling of the government in Afghanistan. Okay, one other thing here, that there's like 2 stories on the internet about this and nothing anywhere else, so it's basically totally classified. So I'm just telling you what I know from basically one newspaper article. So there's this picture here, and it's Arabic, written in Arabic, and this is, was seized by U.S. forces in Syria in about 2003 in a raid. And so this was found amongst some of the belongings of some of the members of Al-Qaeda. It's called the Golden Chain, and it is a list of very early funders of Al-Qaeda. If you look at the list of funders, in addition to the 3, the 3 leaders that I mentioned before, these are all people from wealthy families with advanced degrees, they have lots of opportunity costs, let's just put it that way, right? So terrorism is not a story about poor, disenfranchised people that kind of form an organization. And maybe sometimes it is, but usually that's regional and not very effective from an international standpoint. By the way, at the bottom of the screen here, Al-Qaeda has a flag, right? So their branding, their marketing, they're a bandit. They want governance of some kind. And they'll work with people, so they're opportunistic, right? They'll work with whoever they can to try to accomplish what they want. But they maintain these very pure religious goals. So I think religion is really important to the leadership, and it's a mechanism for other people. It's not as important, or we can't assume that it's equally important across all parts of the organization. 9/11 attacks, this is, again, their kind of golden hour. They work for a long time to get here, and they're, kind of part of my research was tracking attacks over the time. What are they doing? They're learning. They're fixing problems with their attacks, and they're trying to do things better than before. If you want to know everything you can possibly know, again, that's unclassified about the 9/11 attacks, you should read the 9/11 Commission Report, which I'm very thankful was declassified when I was in grad school, because otherwise I would have a lack of information about all this stuff. But this is KSM, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He's still in Guantanamo Bay. He's been there for 2 decades. He loves to talk about 9/11, which is good for intelligence officers, because he's been fairly consistent in a lot of his detainee reports. He is the mastermind of that day. The reason I bring him up is because he wanted to do something bigger and badder than what actually happened. His original plan, so he proposed 9/11 more than one time, and bin Laden turned him down. So he kind of was diligent and kept after bin Laden, and ultimately bin Laden said, sure, let's do it, but we're gonna have a more tame version of what you want to do. So what he ultimately wanted to do was kind of have a bi-coastal attack on the United States. So attacking the East Coast, simultaneously attacking the West Coast, and this was viewed by the leadership as way too risky. Why do I bring this up? Because of what I started with, right? Terrorists weigh risks. If a terrorist group gets caught in the middle of the execution of an attack, they don't terrorize, right? They only terrorize when they're successful because we are then afraid of them. We don't know where they're coming from. We don't know what's happening next. We don't know how much momentum. We don't know anything, right? It's all reactive. That's the problem with intelligence. Intelligence is always reacting to what has already happened. If you can get ahead, you're lucky, but it doesn't work out that way most of the time, right? So this was viewed as putting the organization at such a high risk that they would be caught, dismantled by the US government. So, I mean, at least they were realistic about who they were up against. But even though they kind of changed the plan, if you know, certainly everybody knows this, but if you follow kind of the details of 9/11, right? One of the planes that was headed towards the White House was taken over by passengers after they had learned what had happened already to the other 2 planes, and it crashed in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. This was not in the terrorist plan. That was not part of the plan, right? And so this attack, even as successful as it was from their perspective, high kill rate, high infrastructure destruction rate, right? People running around panicked and terrified. They got what they wanted, but they didn't get it exactly the way that they wanted, right? So there were diversions. And I think that shows us, it helps us understand that they are very adaptive. And so when we do things in the counterterrorism space, right, which is a lot of what happens at DHS, in the military, the IC in general, they are going to respond in kind. So those things are necessary but not sufficient, right? So we have to do both. We have to look at, in my opinion, I think if I had, it's easy to criticize. I'm not doing all of this, right? I'm also not the president of the United States. I wasn't George Bush on 9/11, which is, I don't envy that at all, right? So this is done with a lot of, just respect on my part of knowing that this is a difficult battle that we fight. But I think the problem with the way that we're fighting it is we're overly focused on the supply curve. We're hyper-fixated on how to find the terrorists, track them down, kill them. Again, necessary, but insufficient in the long game. We've got to play the long game and the short game, right? The short game is to minimize threats. The long game is to live in a world where terrorism is so expensive that most people would never say yes. They would never sign up. They would never write a check, right? That's what we want to have happen. So we have to understand kind of what they're doing and how they're doing it. So I will skip some of this, but basically the way Al-Qaeda operated was a very command and control model. This is known as the hub and spoke model. They were very controlling because they don't want anybody going rogue and they don't want anybody getting any ideas on their own. And each of these cells has specialization. So again, you can look at the organization and how it's structured, and you can see specialization in division of labor, interestingly. Right? So there's a communications department. The hijackers, they had one job. The pilots had another job, right? There were chemical weapons experts. There's all sorts of different experts, people who just move munitions around. And so they understood very clearly that they had to have small cells. Those cells were isolated with one another because, again, they didn't want people talking. So when I was working on this, I did a lot of literature. I looked at a lot of literature on cults. Because in some ways they operate in a very similar manner in terms of how they get people amped up internally in the organization. So I think religion, while it loosely affiliates a lot of the members inside Al-Qaeda, I think it's used as a tool to mechanize kind of anti-US rhetoric, hysteria, but momentum inside the organization, right? You've got to get people to follow through. The worst thing that could have happened when the hijackers and the pilots left and came to the United States is that they defected, that they aborted the mission, right? Actually, if you read the 9/11 Commission report, they were told to do very specific things. Get a job, go to the gym, get a girlfriend, get a beer after work. I mean, that's so American, right? Like, blend in. That's what they're told to do, blend in. But the problem with telling people to do that stuff is that it's pretty great. It's great to have a job. It's great to have the freedom to go to the gym. It's great to have a beer. It's great to have a girlfriend. Right? And so they're doing this for operational reasons, but they understand, right, that as they do this over time, the risk of defection goes higher and higher. So there was a very narrow window of time when they wanted them to be in the United States. Today, Al-Qaeda is extremely different than what it was before. So this is just a map. It's kind of, probably can't see it very well, but basically, and I didn't create this map, but grateful that somebody else created it for me, but basically this is showing today Al-Qaeda is very different than what it was at the start. And the reason for that, I believe, is the death of bin Laden, who was an absolute cult of personality. And he was able to organize resources, get people to do what he said, incredibly charismatic speaker, and people listened to him. And with the death of that kind of leader, what has happened to Al-Qaeda is that they have become like a franchise organization, right? So you have more regional affiliates, at least 20. Some have loose affiliations, some call themselves Al-Qaeda in the name, but they have territorial goals. So we're not in 1990 anymore. And so what does this mean for the United States? Well, it might suggest that an attack like 9/11, at least initiated by Al-Qaeda, is not on the radar, or may not be on the radar, but what it is associated with is more terrorism around the world elsewhere. So the world we live in today, if you look at this graph, we have more terrorism in the post-9/11 world than we did before. And this comes to, and I'm going to stop talking in a minute so that you can ask questions and you can then eat food. But basically what you see here is that I think there's been a whole host of unintended consequences, one of which is, again, after 9/11, the United States goes to Afghanistan, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda flee for the mountains of Pakistan. And they just kind of hunker down there for a while. But then what you start to see is that these different kind of organizations emerge that we really hadn't had our eyes on before. ISIS would be one, Boko Haram is one. And so the fracturing of Al-Qaeda and perhaps some of, kind of their response to what we're doing, the response to counterterrorism, has led to different types of regional fights in the world. So what is my solution? I've spent a lot of time talking about, kind of the problems of terrorism. Again, it's different today than it was 25, 30, 40 years ago. It's still a problem, but it's a different type of problem. So when I went to work for the agency, they wanted people who spoke Arabic and could read Arabic, and they wanted terrorist experts. What do you think they want today? China, right? So they want people who speak Mandarin, and they want people who are China experts. I think we have to do both, right? The political headwinds have changed slightly, but terrorism is still an issue. So we really need smart people in the IC working on terrorist intelligence. But I think what my argument in terms of the economic way of thinking and the supply and demand curve argument here is that I think we can look at different policies and how they will affect terrorist organizations. So I'm just going to mention three right now. One is, and we do this a lot, and this is what I did. So we look at ways where we can reduce the resources available to the terrorists. So this is the income effect. How can we reduce their income? So again, that's what I did at the agency. We worked with the Treasury. If we could bring evidence to the US Treasury, this is a terrorist organization, masking itself as a fake NGO that does humanitarian stuff. By the way, you have to be careful, right? Because there are real NGOs out there. They're doing really important life-saving stuff, so you have to be careful. You can't just use a sledgehammer when you're kind of doing counterterrorism financial analysis. So, but there are ways that we can try to reduce the immediate resources available to them. That's one way. But then there's the price-based policy, right? Where we can harden target. This is what we did after 9/11. So we created the Department of Homeland Security. Part of that is the TSA. If you have flown on a plane, you have experienced the TSA, right? So what they're doing, their initiative is to say 9/11 shouldn't have happened in some practical way, right? Like it should be impossible to penetrate the cockpit in an airplane. Right? We know that now, it's like, duh, but maybe we didn't know it or took it for granted before that, right? So we do things to vet passengers before they board the airplane so that the likelihood that you want to carry out a terrorist attack, we can intercept that, right? Again, we can't stop everybody from dreaming of terrorism, but if you start to put the plan into action, we can intercept you. So those work, but they're short term, right? If I catch a terrorist on an airplane, I can successfully say that day we reduced terrorism today. But the problem is what? He's got 50 people behind him ready to do the same thing. So we have to keep up our defensive posture, but it's not enough. So what I want to recommend is thinking about opportunity cost-based policies. How do we shift the opportunity cost faced by the leaders and the members and the joiners of terrorist organizations? And this is a bigger project, and the sad story here is that it's not a matter of policy. Right? So if the United States could successfully make Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Nigeria, some of the worst places today for terrorism, if we could make them democratic and rich, that would solve a lot of our terrorist problems, because people from really rich countries are much less likely to be terrorists. Why? Because they want to do what you're doing. Go to school, get a job, get a girlfriend, get a boyfriend. All this stuff, right? Terrorism is a very unattractive position, even if you're incredibly disgruntled. I'm not saying it's zero. That's the other thing that economics teaches us. We'll never get zero terrorism. I'm not going to end on that note because it sounds depressing. But all we can do is shift that demand curve back so you get less. We've had terrorism since the beginning of time. There's nothing new about it. What was new about 9/11 was the execution. But we have had airplane hijackings in the 70s and 80s, so it wasn't, that part, it wasn't new. It's using the airline as a weapon, as a missile. That's new. We want to stop that, right? But in the long run strategy, it's changing the opportunity cost, and the way we change those opportunity costs is by advancing economic and political freedom around the world. Now that sounds really good, and you might agree, but how we do that is a challenge. How we do that is a challenge. We were in Afghanistan for 20 years. We spent $8 trillion. So there's a great research program at Brown, it's called The Cost of War. They basically track all the costs of the war on terror, including lifetime veteran benefits. They want the entire picture of the full cost. Their projection is $8 to $9 trillion. So just for kind of an interesting mental experiment, $9 trillion, now that's over 20 years. That's like the entire GDP of Japan or Germany. So that's a lot of money to try to do something that we have not really been able to do. Because if you look at the map of terrorist attacks, there's more rather than less. They're not in New York City, they're not in the Pentagon, that's good if you're an American. But the bigger picture is that they're out there and they can still rally against us, right? So 9/11, another 9/11 is not off the table. So I think in line with our short-term policies, we need to come up with some creative longer-term policies to think about a different strategy in a place like Afghanistan, right? How would we kind of work towards those goals in a different way so that we can change opportunity costs into the future? I'm going to stop there, if that's okay, Russ, and then take questions. Do we have time? Okay. If you have questions or comments, I'll take them, and will you just tell me when we need to stop? Okay. Sorry, that was baptism by fire, but that's what happens when you're late. Yeah.
Do you feel like it would need to be an international effort to reduce it? Like everyone would need to be chipping in to raise opportunity costs?
I think that, so her question was, does everybody need to be on board with this idea? I mean, I think it would be better if everybody at least mentally was on board, that that was the right thing to do, or should be part of our long-term strategy. But actually, when you look at like literature on sanctions, one of the things we see is that sanctions are very hard to execute as a group. And it's because, you know, not every country is going to follow through. They might make an agreement and change their mind. And so I think individual countries can have policies about what does it look like to foster free markets and democratic institutions in the most desperately poor and oppressed places in the world. That's a hard set of questions. However, much ink has been spilled trying to figure some of these things out. So I think it's possible. But I think, you know, we need to think about how to support individual actors and businesses in these countries that are not terrorists. Not everybody that lives in Afghanistan today is a terrorist, right? The problem is that the Taliban is basically a narco-terrorist group that is now a stationary bandit and has control, and they're going back to their roots very predictably, right? So this is bad for people who live in Afghanistan because it's very hard to escape those conditions. If you're an American and you're disgruntled, you can leave. If you're an Afghani and you're disgruntled, it's very hard to leave. I'm told that in Pakistan, if you want to emigrate out of the country, you need to be in the top 1% of income earners. That's how you get out. So we might just say, well, just leave, right? That could actually put a lot of pressure on the government if everybody's leaving. That's not good for your government if your entire population leaves, but they have to have the means to leave, right? So I think one way to think about, I mean, that might solve some of the problem, but really, I think the heart of the matter is the broken institutions. One other thing I'll say that makes me optimistic is that if you look at 250 years ago, every country was poor. Everybody in every country lived on subsistence agriculture, and nobody really lived in a democracy. So it's possible. It's fully possible to get economic and political freedom. I think that's what economics teaches me. I think that's what Milton Friedman would say if he was here. It doesn't mean he will. But if we don't believe that Afghanistan can be free and rich, we won't do anything to help it get there. Right? So that's kind of where I get concerned as people will say, well, they just don't want freedom. I don't know about that. I think lots of people want freedom. I think they don't have any vision of what a democratic government looks like. Their government has been the biggest thug on the block. So like democracy is about trusting your government even when you dislike it. And that's we can't expect Afghani citizens to do that today. Now, we can maybe help get them there. But I think the hard thing from a policy position on this is that a lot of these changes are endogenous, and we, at the United States, can't force it. That doesn't mean we're powerless, but I think we can't just snap our fingers or wave our policy wand and say, okay, you're good, go forth and be free or something, because we would have already done that if it was possible. It's a good question, important question. Yeah?
Do you think Afghanistan would be better off like a strong centralized government or like a really decentralized
This is such a great question. We just had a talk at College of Charleston where the speaker she was great, and she was kind of talking about this. And you know, the argument that she was giving, I think, very much applies to Afghanistan, which is that the problem with a centralized government in Afghanistan, if you want that today, is that there's no national identity. And so, I mean, you kind of know what it means to be an American, even though Americans disagree on a lot of stuff, right? I mean, just look at the political news on Twitter. Like, obviously, we disagree on things, but on some of the kind of the fabric of what it means to believe in American political and economic institutions and legal institutions, there's a lot of agreement on that. And so you can build a national consensus around that. I think these are, again, part of the endogeneity problems that I don't think we can solve. But I think a centralized government is going to have to use a lot of force in the absence of political consensus, right? So if you're going to use a centralized government to try to get stability, you're going to have to use a lot of, you know, kind of strong authoritarian hand to get people to fall into line. And I don't think that's going to work unless we would want to go into a country like Afghanistan and just say, we're going to run things and do that indefinitely, which is very expensive and it's not without a lot of risk. Right? So I think a decentralized approach from kind of an international relations and foreign policy perspective is probably the right way. And we've tried to do that, right? So we've tried to kind of identify the different factions in Afghanistan and work with them on the ground. I think that's probably the right approach going into the future. Because again, I think if you're going to go the central route, you're going to need so much force to make that stick. And you're not going to get what you want. You know, you can't force people to be democratic. They have to want that. And that's a bottom-up kind of institutional story. It's a great question. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. You gave us a rational choice account of what motivates terrorist groups, leaders, and ordinary people, or ordinary terrorists. Can you talk about alternative explanations that can also help us account for the behavior of terrorist groups and recruitment? I'm thinking about structural, deeper root conditions, structural conditions, and cultural conditions, and how they fit in your explanation. How do they complement? Do they conflict with rational choice analysis?
Well, I think you can look at different macroeconomic approaches, for example, that try to look at different economic indicators in a society that would lead to people being disenfranchised to the extent that they would do it. So, I mean, I'm a believer in the rational choice perspective. That doesn't mean maybe that it can do all the explaining, but I think it's an important element that I'm happy that now if you look at the literature, it's much more prevalent, that people are kind of citing that model and incorporating it. But I do think, you know, there's a lot of, for example, literature on psychological forces, right? So just what the individual terrorist perceives and how much that matters for what they're going to do or not do, or what type of group they're going to be a part of. So I think there can be some complementarity, perhaps, there. I'm not sure that those trends allow us to understand the behavior of the group once it forms together, right? Because you have to kind of have a cohesive plan of action for how people are going to behave internally. I also think just, you know, on the rational choice model, I do think it helps us explain both group terrorism and lone wolf terrorism, although lone wolf terrorism is very different, right? And so the organizing principle isn't there. You can do what you want, right? You can strap a grenade to your vest and go enter a subway and do that all on your own. So I think there's more of the psychology literature deals with that type of terrorism rather than group terrorism can use things like theory of the firm, public goods types of questions like with Olson. And so those are some that I think complement but come from slightly different perspective that help us understand. What I was worried about at the beginning, and again, this is just kind of living through 9/11. Well, first of all, there wasn't a lot of academic literature at all. So when we went to write our book last year, there's like 9,000 academic articles that have published broadly on the topic of terrorism, so that was a fun literature review, right? There's just, everybody's writing about it from a variety of different perspectives. And so I think that's a great thing, right? Because I think that we can have a bigger and better picture. So the only thing I'm kind of, I worry about is the profiling literature, where we say, you know, we can categorize people in a certain way and say, maybe you're more likely to become a terrorist just because of your religion or, you know, your education level or your income level. And I don't think that has a lot of explanatory power, but I think it's very attractive to people to kind of think that way, right? Because it allows us to create these boxes and put people in them, and then use policy to sort out what we're going to do with the boxes. And so I worry about that because I think it's too antithetical, perhaps, to the rational choice model. Thank you.
Maybe one last short question, and we'll.
Okay. Anyone? Yeah.
Is there, this long-winded question, is there violent terrorism coming out of China, or is it all narco-terrorism? And how, is that like a fundamentally different issue if it's like state-sponsored, like a thing like fentanyl?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I don't, so I am not as focused on terrorism coming out of China, so I'm sorry I can't fully answer your question, but I can kind of answer it in some way on principle, I guess. When I started doing this research, I really wanted to separate terrorist groups that were independent versus being sponsored by a state. So, and now, you know, you look at the literature now and you actually see people making those, separating those. Because certainly if a terrorist organization is funded by a state in large part, or an arm of a state, then it has access to resources and other things that another, you know, kind of Al-Qaeda is like a bunch of guys that get together and they become highly organized under the leadership of this one person. That I wanted to study. And I also wanted to study, is this something we should expect more of? Right, is this easy? And I think it's not easy, but actually 9/11, this is a little off topic. 9/11 cost, we believe, $400,000 to $500,000. So it's not a money problem. That's nothing. That is nothing. This guy's billionaire's son. So it's not about money, it's about coordination. And I think when you're a state-sponsored group, coordination is easier. I think when you're Al-Qaeda and you're kind of emerging out of nothing, coordination is not as easy. So when we look at whether it's China or any other government, whether it's narco-terrorism or something like this, I think the state-sponsored groups just have different capacity levels. And we might have a different approach to them, right? Because diplomacy matters. You know, no matter how we feel about the Chinese government, diplomacy is still an important form of statecraft as we deal with the Chinese. You don't have to care about diplomacy with Al-Qaeda, right? It's like a different ballgame in terms of what you're going to do about it. But terrorist organizations like the Taliban today and Al-Qaeda today, but before as well, I mean, they'll be the first ones to kind of say you should never touch alcohol, you should never touch drugs, and they funnel both of those things and many other things. So most terrorists are very smart with their funding, especially these independent terrorist organizations, because again, they only have themselves and anybody else that they could regionally try to cooperate with. But even then, they might view resources as a zero-sum game, right? So like if the Taliban gets this resource, then I don't have it. That's not, I think, the same dynamic that's happening when you have a state-sponsored group that's moving fentanyl or anything else, arms, it could be anything, right? But terrorist groups are smart and they diversify their portfolios. So they are not just going to use, you know, raise revenue in one way, drugs or arms. And many terrorist organizations, again, the independent ones use legitimate sources of funding as well. They sell, you know, kind of normal goods and services as well as kind of illegal black market activity, including trafficking and smuggling and all sorts of things. So, sorry I can't be more specific on China, but generally that's how we kind of try to think about those different types of groups and their behavior.
Thank you much.
Thank
We have
you.
some food.